Today I want to speak to you about God's work in David's life again. And today, David's life in 1 Samuel 27, his course takes a bit of a turn. He's still fleeing from Saul, who's still, for whatever reason, is in Saul's mind, still not sure what to do with David, I think, at this point. He sometimes pursues him, sometimes he doesn't. Sometimes he gets stimulated to pursue him by others, like as he was in chapter 26 by the Ziphites, as we discussed last week. But today, there will be no Saul pursuing after David. It's a totally different subject. Where we read this morning, though, before we began as we began our worship service, from Psalm 23. And Psalm 23 is a psalm of David. It's perhaps his most famous psalm, of course. It's recited at funerals, and it's recited when people are in desperate, difficult times and things like that. But there's an interesting turn of verse in that psalm, where in verse 5, David writes, "Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies." And this follows, of course, verse 4, that's probably the most, well, I don't know if they're all famous verses, really. But that's the verse that tells us that he would walk through the valley of the shadow of death and fear no evil because God is with him. But then he says immediately after that thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. And it's a very interesting turn of phrase and very odd sounding, really, for us. I mean, I think of survival is what you think David is thinking about when he's wandering around the wilderness trying to escape David, or trying to escape Saul, and trying to escape whatever other perils might come his way. But his life has been full of challenges up to this point especially. He's had some great victories, of course, great, wonderful victories. And he'll have other victories in this chapter, too, of a different variety. But his relationship with Saul is tumultuous at best. And so he was constantly fleeing from David. David was constantly fleeing from Saul, and certainly going through the valley of the shadow of death on a regular basis. I mean, it seems like he went back and forth through the valley. It's not like he went through it one time. And our lives are like that. You know, typically you don't have just one thing you have to deal, one difficulty in life, one temptation, one struggle, one threat, one risk that you must face, but several. And thinking back to my great aunt who celebrated her 105th birthday, 105 years. She was born right before the Spanish flu outbreak in this country and before the United States entered World War II. So she saw that, World War I, yes, and World War II. She saw the Great Depression. She saw Vietnam. She saw Korea. She saw the crazy revolution of the 60s. And now she's living through what we're seeing today. Thankfully, she's a bit sheltered from what's going on today. In every respect. I'm grateful for that, frankly. She's been through enough. But we are not going to just if we live long enough, we're going to go through the valley a lot. We're going to go back and forth through that valley, or we're going to stand at the edge of it, terrified, and do nothing. One of the greatest failures is the failure to do nothing. You'd be better to fail in effort than fail in inaction, in my opinion. But David never failed for inaction. He was always a man of bold choices and so forth, and was filled, surrounded by people. His company was filled with people who were of even bolder action that David had to rein in a lot. But it's hard to find people that are willing to be bold and be wise at the same time. But there are countless people who are willing to stand on the sidelines and do nothing. And I pray that the Lord will stimulate us and strengthen us and give us encouragement to act. But I'm here to tell you, one, that God is in your life in great and small things. This morning we were discussing about Moses and the striking of the rock and the water giving forth and the people complaining and so forth. I'm just going to share a mostly unrelated anecdote with you, but I want to encourage you in the small things, because it's very easy for us to go to God with the big things and to think that that's what he's interested in. Don't bother me with the small stuff. Don't sweat the small stuff. Don't bother God with the small stuff. That seems to be our typical mode of operating a lot of times. But I'm here to tell you that God is interested in every trial that you face, and he would prefer that you bring those to him and you trust him in the small things, and you're going to more likely trust him with the big things later on, by the way. But yesterday I was putting in a new light, well, an old light actually, in our kitchen. Our fan, we have a fan in our kitchen of all things, and anyway, it stopped working, so I took it out. Well, when I took it off the ceiling, this big heavy old fan, I removed it from the ceiling, and I realized that the bracket, the metal bracket that was screwed into the ceiling, was actually cracked in half. So the only thing holding it up there was the will of God. You know, I'm telling you, I mean, it should have fallen. The bracket was just, the little cast metal bracket was broken in half, and it was just hanging up there. I don't know why it hadn't fallen sooner. But I'm very grateful to God to make the light stop working and the fan stop working so that I take that thing down, because it could easily have fallen on you while you're cooking over a hot blazing surface. That's very dangerous. Very, very dangerous. So I took that out, and then I put an old a light fixture from another room, I put it in. Well, if you've ever done any kind of work like that, it's tight quarters, because you got these tiny little cords that are about 3 inches long, things like, and you got to hook them together. Well, and if you got hands like mine, I can palm a basketball, folks. I mean, it's hard to get my hands in there, that tiny little space. And so then you got these little wire nuts, and I used the wire nuts that had been on there, and I put it on there, and then pulled it off, and then I got down and I flipped it, and it didn't come on. Well, that's not good. So I changed the bulb out that I put in there. Nope, that didn't work. Changed the bulb out, still didn't work as well. I know that bulb's good, so I had to take the fixture down. But here I'm going to tell you, before I got to all the electrical problems that I faced with that, and all the cramped quarters problems that I faced with that, I had a problem with screws. So I had to go get screws to put it into the ceiling. So with this, it took me altogether at least 2 hours to put a small fixture that I told Michelle I'd be done with in 30 minutes. And at one point, she could tell you that I was very frustrated. I was upset because I couldn't get my hands in there to get the screws in, and I couldn't get them from the bottom because they're not long enough, because they can't be too long because there's not that much space for them either. So I just said, Lord, honestly, I don't know what to do. I need help. Please show me what to do. It worked. Almost instantaneously, problem was solved. No, it just, the screws fit, and the light fixture went on there, and so forth and so on, and from there it was just tedium to get it all worked out. So I'm here to tell you that little things like that, don't be afraid to go to God. You're not troubling him, okay? He has infinite power and resources at his disposal. You're not going to catch him in the middle of something and you go, hold on, just wait a minute, I don't have time for that. God doesn't run out of ears to hear for his children. He's paying attention, okay? Anyway, so David was a man who, it says here in verse 1 of 1 Samuel 27, and David said in his heart, I shall now perish one day by the hand of Saul. There's nothing better for me than that I should speedily escape into the land of the Philistines. And Saul shall despair of me to seek me any more in any coast of Israel. So shall I escape out of his hand. And David arose, and he passed over with the 600 men that were with him unto Achish, the son of Maoch, the king of Gath. And David went with Achish dwelt with Achish at Gath, he and his men, every man with his household, even David with his 2 wives, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess, and Abigail the Carmelitess, Nabal's wife. And it was told Saul that David was fled to Gath, and he sought no more again for him. Now, you don't really know what was going on through Saul's mind, but it doesn't really matter because Saul's out of the picture. Saul thought, out of sight, out of mind. Not my problem anymore. Now, the reality is he's no farther away than like Marietta from Roswell. I mean, seriously, it's not very far from Gath to Gibeah. But be that as it may, in that day and age, it took a long time to get from one place to the other, and you're going to pass through a lot of countryside and dangerous territory if you're on the wrong side of the law, as it were. So Saul pretty much wrote him off. And David goes into foreign territory. Who was from Gath? Who was the most famous person from Gath? Anybody remember? His name also starts with a G. Goliath. Exactly. Goliath was from Gath. Why in the world does David go to Gath? It seems crazy. On the surface, you go, oh, he's just going to the next town over. Well, that's on the map. It's the next town over. He is crossing over to foreign territory. These people are not Hebrews. They do not speak Hebrew unless it's as a secondary language. This is not their people. These are idol worshipers. These are not God's people. Why in the world does he go to Gath? That just tells you everything you need to know about what he thought of Saul. It was safer to go to the Philistines than it was to stay in Israel. That's bad. That's, whenever people, it never fails. Whoever's getting elected, somebody says and gets in the headlines for saying, I'm going to move to Canada, right? It seems to be the go-to. I'm going to Canada. I bet Canada goes, no, you're not. No, we don't want you here. Or any other place, right? And it's similar to when the pilgrims came here, right? It was so bad, spiritually speaking, for them over in Europe that they would rather risk a sea journey of 3 months, which they easily could have died at sea. I would have died. I would have died at sea. I'm here to tell you. I'd have died of starvation because I would have puked myself to death. It's a terrible journey. It's a terrible journey. It's called the Middle Passage when they're talking about the slaves coming over in desperate conditions. It's not an easy journey, 3 months at sea, in small ships that toss you about. So they would rather escape from Europe and risk coming here with nothing and no real skill in how to do it. You go, oh, well, they grew up when it was a lot easier to be. No, those people were not farmers. They were like cobblers and blacksmiths and writers and preachers and stuff like that. They were not Bear Grylls, right? So it's important to understand these people were not ready to do whatever, and most of them died as a result of that. But they risked it. Why? Because the threat in the old country was worse in their minds than the threat here. And that's been the case a lot of times. That's why people immigrate. That's why people have been running out of Syria for the last several years. That's why they run out of various places of Africa. That's why people come here to the United States, because it is a land of promise. It's a land of opportunity, per se. So David is fleeing because he is concerned for himself and his household and that of all his 600 men as well. Now, I don't know if you can interpret that with the 600 men to mean it's 600 men plus their wives and children, or if it's 600 total. I think it's probably 600 men plus their wives and children, honestly, because it describes him taking portions of that as an army, and I think it's usually referring to the men as part of the army, and their households are added to that. But regardless, it's hundreds and hundreds of people that he is going to Gath with. So he's not just showing up with him and a couple of folks. It's a lot of people. It'd be like my entire office going to somewhere and saying, hey, could you give us some kind of shelter? Can you give us some sort of asylum? And so that's where he's going. He's going to seek asylum in a foreign country. He's seeking asylum from his own country, because he's considered in many places a traitor. In many other places, he's considered a hero, but in other places, he's considered a traitor. The Ziphites apparently were on the traitor side, but they were certainly not alone. But be that as it may, he's fleeing to Gath, where Goliath was from. So without doubt, this is not where you would think would be the first place to look for him. But it's also a place where he would have one of the greatest reputations. Not necessarily positive great reputations, but he would certainly be well known. He would certainly be well known in the hometown of the giant whom he slew, the champion of the Philistines. But he escaped. And he goes and he says to Achish, who is the king of this area, Well, the Philistines were not a homogenous group. They didn't have one single leader, okay? There's lots of city-states, if you will. That's what the historians refer to it as. And he is he goes to Gath. So if you see on the picture, Gath is in the top left-hand corner, just inside that dotted line. Gath's well inside the Mediterranean Sea, and Gath is still there today. You can go there. Not much of a place, I don't think, but it's there. So David said unto Achish, if I have now found grace in thine eyes, let them give me a place in some town in the country, that I may dwell there. For why should thy servant dwell in the royal city with thee? Then Achish gave him Ziklag that day, wherefore Ziklag pertaineth unto the kings of Judah unto this day. And the time that David dwelt in the country of the Philistines was a full year and 4 months. And David and his men went up and invaded the Gershurites and the Gezrites and the Amalekites, for those nations were of old the inhabitants of the land, as thou goest to Shur, even unto the land of Egypt. So David takes up residence in this town called Ziklag, which, by the way, that is the pronunciation, Ziklag. It's a funny name. No one really knows exactly where it is. There have been a dozen sites that have been identified as the place of Ziklag. As it turns out, in the last year, January 2019, there was a dig in near Jerusalem, not near Jerusalem, I should say, in Israel. Everything's close to Jerusalem in relative terms, but in the star there, which is called Kirbet al-Rai, it's a hill there. That hill, they dug up another site, and they think today that is the site of Ziklag, because it has all the right signs. It has pottery and signs of the Philistines from the era before David, and it shows signs of inhabitation during the time period associated with the time of King David, and very importantly, you're going to find out in the chapter ahead, it shows evidence of a great fire between those two periods. That this town's going to get ransacked, burnt to the ground in the coming chapters. But David is here. David takes up with his 600 people, 600 men plus whatever else, and they take up residence in this town. Now, there's no mention of what happens to the people who live there. I don't know if they just come in and they go, y'all are out, or if they just say, you can have this area and you can take up residence wherever you see fit, or what. I don't know. None of that is explained, and it's not terribly relevant to the story. But David dwelt there for a year and 4 months. A year and 4 months. And during that time period, David, it says, went up with his men and invaded the Geshurites and the Gezrites and the Amalekites. Now, the Amalekites are the old hated enemies, the Amalekites of Israel. And their whole land was basically to the southeast, from Gaza on the left there, all the way down to Beersheba, and over on the right, the Gershurites, the Geshurites and the Gezrites and the Amalekites in various numbers lived in those areas and had been inhabitants of the land. And they were supposed to be driven out by the tribes. They're not supposed to be there. And so David takes this opportunity, because he's on kind of the south end of this area of the Philistines, to make his forays from there into the foreign lands. Now listen very carefully to what David says to the king. Then David smote the land and left neither man nor woman alive, and took away the sheep and the oxen and the asses and the camels and the apparel, and returned and came to Achish. He came back to the king. And Achish said, whither have ye made a road today? And David said, against the south of Judah, and against the south of the Jerahmeelites, and against the south of the Kenites. And David saved neither man nor woman alive to bring tidings to Gath, saying, lest they should tell on us, saying, So did David, and so will be his manner with all the while he dwelleth in the country of the Philistines. And Achish believed David, saying, He hath made his people Israel utterly to abhor him. Therefore he shall be my servant forever. So there's a couple of things going on in this passage that are kind of odd. One, David goes and slaughters an entire group of people. Actually, 3 different groups of people. Now, before you have pity on them, they were horrible, 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 horrible people. Okay, so and they're going to show that once again very soon. Don't have too much pity. But what he says when he comes back, Achish says, whither have you made a road today? That's an interesting term. Where'd you go today? And he says, I went to the south of Judah and the south of the Jerahmeelites, and again the south of the Kenites. He doesn't say I didn't attack my people. He just says I went south of these 3 places. And that is accurate. That is an accurate, truthful statement, by the way. It's just the way Achish interpreted it. It's the way Achish interpreted it. Now, these other people were not necessarily allies of the Philistines, but they were people who lived in the land. Because the land of Canaan was inhabited by many, many different tribes of people. The Philistines and the Geshurites, and the Gezerites and the Amalekites only being some of them. Many of them were descendants of Esau. So they should have been brethren to the Israelites, but they turned out to be quite the opposite. Be that as it may, however, David didn't save neither man nor woman alive to bring tidings to Gath. That was his purpose. He wiped them out for multiple reasons. Now, if you remember in previous chapters, Saul had been told to kill them. Absolutely. And before them, Joshua and the Israelites were told to wipe them out completely. If you give quarter to this type, unfortunately, there is bad things that will happen. That sounds unmerciful, and I'm afraid sometimes that's when mercies run out. These people have been given plenty of mercy. Plenty of mercy. So David is making use of his time in this area, and he's not stopped fighting for Israel, is the point. He's not at all stopped fighting for Israel. In fact, he's using this as a safe home base to do so Saul's not attacking him. A lot of us feel like, well, we're trying to trap. We can't do what we normally do, right? We either feel like we can't go outside, or we can't go where we want to normally go, or we can't do the things we would normally feel led to do while this pandemic is going on. Or maybe not the pandemic. Maybe you're concerned about going certain places because you might feel it's not safe to go, for maybe there's riots or some other thing, or whatever reason in life. Maybe it has nothing to do with those things, and you feel like that I can no longer serve or do the things that I would have done in this other capacity at a different time of life, because there's some threat or some hindrance that keeps me constrained. Well, you could just sit back and go, you and all the folks that are with you say, yep, I guess we'll just have to wait this one out. Or you could be like David and find an opportunity. David was a man that looked for opportunities to do the right thing. It's important for us to seek to do the right thing, to not be weary in well-doing, but to, as the old saying goes, you work it one way and it doesn't work, you work it a different way. Try and try again, right? So Ziklag is his home base of operation. Very interesting little archaeological dig around that place, but that's for another day. So if you're looking at this, just so you can orient, if you're looking at a map in your own Bible, you can see Jerusalem in the top right-hand corner. You can see En-Gedi there down near where it says Dead Sea. Remember, he was there not that long ago. That's an oasis. And there's Hebron, which becomes his capital for a long time before he takes Jerusalem later on. and Gath has already been mentioned, and Ashdod, and Ashkelon, and Gaza. So today you hear the Gaza Strip, right? These are the kind of things that make these things meaningful to you. And there's Beersheba in the bottom. And all these are very historical, important sites. Just to orient you. In today's day and age, though, I don't have a problem with someone seeking my physical life. At least I don't know of anyone that's seeking. There could be somebody out there that would like to do me in, but I don't think there's anybody specifically with my name on a card anywhere that's I'm going to have to be worried about. But we do have concerns about other Christians, certainly, so-called at times, and certainly within our own ranks, or even maybe within our own homes at times, but certainly within our nation more broadly, we have what I might refer to as disorderly brothers. Disorderly brothers, and that's using the term somewhat lightly. This was not a thing that was uncommon at all in the early church. You think, a lot of people look back to the first century church and they go, oh, it must have been wonderful. The good old days of the first century church, when everything was clear and easy and right. They were all in there, they were all worshiping together, and they had everything in common, and it must have been perfect. Well, no. The apostles argued amongst themselves from time to time. So the leadership wasn't always perfectly aligned. I think they stayed aligned once they realigned, but they didn't stay that way all the time. And the farther the church went, the further dispersed it was, the more difficult it became for them to stay on the same page. And Paul went to all these different churches early on, and he helped establish many of them. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, the second letter to the Thessalonians, it's important to notice the second one, so you had to address them twice. It says, now we command you, brethren, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that ye withdraw yourselves from every brother that walketh disorderly, and not after the tradition which he received of us. For yourselves know how ye ought to follow us, for we behaved not ourselves disorderly among you. Neither did we eat any man's bread for naught, but wrought with labor and travail night and day, that we might not be chargeable to any of you. Not because we have not power, but to make ourselves an ensample unto you, to follow us. For even when we were with you, this we commanded you, that if any would not work, neither should he eat. For we hear that there are some which walk among you disorderly, working not at all, but are busybodies. Now them which are such we command and exhort by our Lord Jesus Christ, that with quietness they work and eat their own bread. But ye, brethren, be not weary in well-doing. And if any man obey not our word by this epistle, note that man, and have no company with him, that he may be ashamed. Yet count him not as an enemy, but admonish him as a brother. Now the Lord of peace himself give you peace, always by all means. May the Lord be with you all. The Lord be with you all. Wonderful, wonderful passage. And there's a lot to unpack here. We won't dig into all of it in complete detail today. But first of all, this is a commandment. Now we command you, right? We apostles, we command. In the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. So it's not their idea. This is the Lord's doing. That they're the withdrawal from every disorderly brother. But note the end of the passage. The end of the passage, he says, if any man, in verse 14, if any man obey not our word by this epistle, note that man, and have no company with him, that he may be ashamed. Yet count him not as an enemy, but admonish him as a brother. So the importance within the church, particularly the church body, when someone is walking disorderly, and which is to say, against the commandments of Christ, against the teachings of the church, and they have no good reason for it, so they're living in sin and they're stirring up trouble in various means, we're to distance ourselves from that person, but not to treat them as an enemy. It's a very important thing here. Very often, unfortunately, in the church, the distancing is done with an axe. You know, I'm afraid it's been done with an axe, right? Chop it loose, like some mooring line for a ship, so that we can totally separate. But that was the whole idea in Paul's writing here, to have no company, but that he may be ashamed, right? So a person who is ashamed will hopefully repent and return unto the body. But if this is not done early, by the way, this kind of thing festers and grows, and it gets bigger until the church will split right down the middle, and you'll have a fractured church. And that's what we have today, of course. It's not been done very well. But just like they say in a family, in the home environment, the children need to be disciplined fairly, and they need to be disciplined consistently. And you need to start early with a child. You can't wait till they're 14 to start disciplining them. You're going to have a disaster on your hands if you wait that long. So just as similarly in the church, we need to be smart about what we do. But if someone say, I meet a Christian on the street who's not part of my particular body, obviously I don't have any authority over such a person. What am I to do? Paul would say that we're to tread carefully. If they are in sin, if they're running down a road they ought not to be running down, certainly we are to admonish them if possible, and have no company. Don't join them in their sin, but also don't treat them as an enemy, right? It can't become an us and them kind of situation. So David left out of Israel to escape from Saul because Saul is acting in a very disorderly manner. He's in charge. He's the one that should be doing everything right, but he's acting completely crazy and totally sinful and abandoning the will of God. And yet David has said, if I'm going to survive, I need to leave. Now, I don't know why he came to that particular conclusion at this point, not earlier, but this is when he came to that conclusion. And so he flees to Gath for that reason. And he is safe the whole time he's in Gath. He never has any issues. Saul doesn't pursue him and so forth. So sometimes you got to go off the mountaintop of death into the valley of the shadow of death, because the shadow of death is less dangerous than the mountaintop. On the mountaintop, you might get struck by lightning or going blown off by the wind. Sometimes God's going to lead you through something that seems way more dangerous to you because you never see what was really dangerous, because he leads you through. He leads you through it all. That's a very important point. And so David is led safely through this time period in his life because he's fleeing, if you will. He is separating his company from Saul. And from everybody else, by the way, that was in cahoots with Saul. And you're going to see in the end that they're all going to come back to David ashamed. They will come back to him eventually ashamed, and there will be reconciliation. But it's going to take a long time. It's going to take a long time. Now here I'm going to ask you a question. What do you think is going to happen when Jesus comes back and takes his throne appropriately, as it were, right? Or he already has his throne, but if he comes and enforces his throne and his claim upon the earth at the end of time, the word says that every knee shall what? Bow. Every knee's not going to bow because of out of respect. Some is going to bow out of shame and terror. But they will bow. Count him not as an enemy, but admonish him as a brother. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 1 says, let brotherly love continue. End stop. Full stop. Period. End of sentence. Let brotherly love continue. It's so easy for us to let brotherly love die. But you're going to see that David never stops respecting and loving Saul, even though the feeling is not reciprocated. Now, we don't have to get into all this other part of it that we'll discuss during the weekly lesson on Wednesday. But I would point out one other particular point, and that's verse 13. But ye, brethren. So you, the ones that aren't going disorderly, you that aren't going astray, you that are the other brother, the brother of the prodigal child, right? Don't be weary in well-doing. You that are faithful to the church, don't be weary. Don't get worn out seeking God's will. Don't get worn out, but be comforted by the presence of God. By the very thing that you hold dear, look to it. That's why I told you probably up front, whatever your small problems are, take them to God. And trust me, your life will be way better if you go ahead and take the little things. You won't get tired because those little things, they pile up, don't they? They pile up and they become a problem. I mean, you ever seen a 5-pound bag of sugar? You know what it's made up of? Tiny little grains of sugar. And each one of those, that's no problem. I could carry those. But you start piling up enough of those and you're like, well, it's got some weight to it. That's the way our problems are in life. They seem like no bother. I could swallow that. It's no big deal. I could deal with that. Enough of them becomes a problem. And so Paul wrote to the Romans in similar fashion. He says, dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves, but rather give place unto wrath, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. I spoke about this last week. But look at the second part in verse 20 and 21. Therefore, if thine enemy hunger, feed him. If he thirst, give him drink. For in so doing, thou shalt heap coals of fire on his head. Be not overcome of evil, but overcome evil with good. Do you get what this picture is of, by the way? Can you see what it is? Yeah. What perspective is it of the cross? At the foot of the cross. We need to remember where we stand, or where we ought to be standing, at the foot of the cross. And remember the immense sacrifice that Christ gave. Now, this is obviously just someone made a cross and took a picture of it. But the actual cross, the implement of death that it was, would have been stained with blood and nail marks and all kinds of other telltale signs of the gruesome work that was done with it. Jesus heaped immense coals of fire on the enemy's heads. David went into the land of the enemy, and what was Achish convinced of? David had done him what he thought was good for him, and what did he was? Wow, he's going to be my servant forever. I mean, he's made those people in Israel hate him so much, he ain't going nowhere. This powerful man that beat my champion Goliath, now I've got him. Awesome. That's fantastic. He didn't really understand what was going on. David was playing both sides of the fence. Therefore, if thine enemy hunger, feed him. If he thirst, give him drink. Because if you do that, you're gonna drive him to action. He's gonna go one way or the other, but he's not going to be able to stand it. But in the end, the biggest thing is overcoming evil, not with more evil. You know how you put out a fire? Not by making the fire you're fighting bigger, right? I know with forest fires, you burn a fire line, but you don't go and make the fire itself bigger. You fight it with its opposite, right? You suffocate the fire. The way you suffocate evil and destruction and wickedness is by suffocating it with goodness. Suffocating it with, you starve it of what it wants. You starve it of what's feeding it. You starve it. So we must overwhelm the evil in our life with good. You overcome the sins in your life, the temptations, by starving yourself of the temptations, right? How do you quit cigarettes? Do you keep smoking them? No. You stop smoking them, right? You don't go near that aisle in the grocery store, and you don't hang out with somebody who's smoking because the temptation to go, hey, can I have one of those? And that's just a type of temptation. Much more sinful, terrible things people do. Whether it's being unfaithful to their wife, or lying and cheating on their neighbors, stealing their neighbor's things. We don't even, if you have a problem with those things, you don't go near them. You starve yourself of it. You starve yourself of those things until the desire dies. Until the desire dies. So we overcome evil in ourselves that way, and you overcome evil in the world that way. We have to smother that which is evil with good. I will be the last person in this church. I'm pretty convinced I'll be the last person to say, let's go down and protest the protesters. I'm going to tell you, I'll be the last person, because I do not think that is a solution that works. I'm not going to convince someone not to shout at me by shouting at them. Doesn't make sense, right? This is like, the harder you throw the rubber ball, the harder it's going to bounce right back at you. To me, I feel like the church and Christians need to buckle down and show the good of the church. The reason why there's so much injustice in the world is because we've allowed there to be injustice and things like that in the world. The reason why there's confusion is because we've allowed there to be confusion. We've let down our guard for various reasons, and I'll be first to tell you I've been part of that. But I also know the solution is straightforward. Loving your neighbor, and sometimes loving your neighbor means distancing yourself from their actions, praying for them, ministering to them, and holding them to a higher standard. We must overcome evil with good, and David is biding his time until the Lord deals with Saul. He will not avenge himself, but rather he will still do good. He is proving to Israel, if not to Saul, that he is still about the Israelite game. He is going about fighting Israel's enemies, even though he is not in Israel. So even if you have to go through the valley of the shadow of death to the other side and leave people back on the other side of the valley who aren't willing to go with you, who aren't willing to travel with you, they should know where you're going and who you're going with. You should be carrying a banner that says, I am with God. And your life should scream, I love Jesus.